In 1968, Northern Ireland Catholics marched for equality. Old grievances, new voices. Non-violent action. Violent reaction. In October, Derry was a city on the march. But the Unionist government ordered the police to stop the demonstration. Protestant police under Protestant control, Catholic dissent. Confrontation was inevitable.
As we reached the police cordon, someone on the back pushed, and we were just immediately in connection with the police. Then a policeman who obviously knew me, he made a race over from the other side, and he hit me on the head with the baton. I then was in the process of falling to the ground, and he rushed over again to make doubly sure, and he hit me a second time with the baton. The second time the blood began to flow very freely from my head.
For many Protestants, the Civil Rights Association was no more than a Republican front, a drive to end British rule in Northern Ireland, a Catholic plot.
Deceived! The CRA is a Republican front organization, and the real enemy of every Ulster Protestant is the system of the papacy.
Derry was only the beginning. Civil Rights March will continue indefinitely until we achieve for all citizens in Northern Ireland the same rights and privileges which are enjoyed. If it is good enough for Doncaster, it is good enough for Derry. If it is good enough for Birmingham, it is good enough for Belfast. We want one man, one vote. We want that immediately. I will not give up this fight until we have finally achieved.
The 50-year-old Unionist establishment was in confusion.
What kind of Ulster do you want? A happy and respected province in good standing with the rest of the United Kingdom, or a place continually torn apart by riots and demonstrations and regarded by the rest of Britain as a political outcast? As always in a democracy, the choice is yours.
Ulster chose to take to the streets. On New Year's Day, 1969, students were on the march from Belfast to Londonderry in deliberate imitation of the black civil rights activists of the USA. But this was Ulster, not America. Their march through Protestant countryside met resistance at every turn. Stony, menacing faces lined the route. As trouble threatened, the march was rerouted. Frustration was building on both sides. At Burt Tollet Bridge, there was open conflict. An ambush from above, a loyalist attack with the crudest of weapons and motives. Amid police confusion, some said collusion, the civil rights marchers were helpless. Those who could joined the police in flight. Others were not so fortunate. Attack and intimidation had turned the marchers into heroes, and their reception in Derry, as the Catholics preferred to call it, was rapturous. Boosted by new confidence, Catholics refused to halt their campaign for equal rights. Caught between Catholic frustration and Protestant anger, Prime Minister O'Neill was forced to resign. Londonderry, as they prefer to call it, has a special significance for Protestants. And once a year they celebrate their deliverance from Catholic control in the 17th century. In spite of the chaos around them, the defense of the city against the Catholic King James would be remembered. With a history of high unemployment and with time on their hands, Derry's business has always been conducted on the streets. The 12th of August, behind the old city walls, loyalist remembrance. In the bogside, below and beyond, Catholic resentment. The apprentice boys, inheritors of the Protestant defenders, reoccupy the city for a day. The people, the Protestant people, were angry and confused. The old order was under threat. Waiting behind the police lines, the city's Catholics were awakened by a new derriere. Two communities, two cultures on collision course. The first stone was cast. Within minutes, a full-scale riot was in progress. On one side, stones and petrol bombs. On the other, lung-choking CS gas. The embers of an old fire had been rekindled.
As an Irishman, I'm reluctant to accept any degree of British rule, but when the house is burning, I suppose you don't ask whether the fireman's a Protestant or a Catholic. There must come a promise of a completely new deal here, and I think that Dublin, Belfast and London must get together. It's too early yet to say just what the outcome will be, but already the harm has been done. The 50-year-old dam that has been building up has been burst, and well, it's over to God after that.
God, a rifle, a bayonet, and a British soldier behind it. Troops were deployed the following day, and after 50 years of neglect, the Irish question was back on the British political agenda, a colonial problem of its own making. Troops would buy time. Time for the politicians to sort things out, they hoped. A concerned Labour Home Secretary, James Callaghan, arrived in Delhi.
You have engaged my energies. I will apply myself within the limits of my responsibilities to this problem. I cannot pretend to attempt to find a solution to it overnight. I can, however, pledge that my energies are at the disposal of the people of Northern Ireland.
In Belfast, the situation had deteriorated more rapidly than had been expected. The arrival of a neutral army was more acceptable to the Catholic community than the attentions of a mainly Protestant police force. An exhausted, demoralized, and overwhelmed Royal Ulster Constabulary had lost control. As Belfast burned, British soldiers, sent in a support role, were cast into the front line. Tiredness, frustration, and anger boiled over on a regular basis. The fires lit in Derry and in the back streets of Belfast were being fueled on a daily and nightly basis. One of the greatest population movements in Europe since the Second World War was about to begin. British politicians arrived with hastily prepared plans for a solution. Meanwhile, whole city communities were on the move. Hatred and suspicion was at fever pitch. Daylight revealed the extent of the division.
Come on, where are you going? Come on!
The temporary peace lines erected then are now a permanent feature of West and North Belfast. The initial welcome for British troops melted more rapidly.
The honeymoon period for the use of troops can be very short-lived. I think we're probably at the top of the peak of the honeymoon period now. If, for example, something very constructive and helpful doesn't come out of the meeting in Westminster tomorrow between the Prime Ministers and Ulster, men of all sides, feel that there is some hope, then the honeymoon period could finish in a matter of hours.
Almost overnight, Belfast had become a war zone. British troops had been deployed, and there seemed little hope of them ever being withdrawn. A battle-trained military force was doing a policeman's job and failing. This was no place for soldiers, but who else could control the situation? The general knew his politics better than his political masters. Soldiers are not policemen, and within days that was becoming obvious. A curfew imposed on the Catholic Lower Falls in Belfast caused widespread resentment. So did the military lack of understanding of Irish sensitivities. Within a matter of weeks, hospitality had given way to hostility.
The British Army! Hit the British Army! Clap your hands!
The military response was straight from the manual. Pitched battles ebbed and flowed in Catholic areas. Childish games began to assume a deadly significance. But something even more sinister was stirring behind the hastily erected Catholic barricades. A growing number of Republicans believed that the message of 1916 of armed revolution would have its day. Then the Irish Republican Army sought to drive Britain from Ireland. They had failed, and successive IRA campaigns had proved futile. IRA stood for I Ran Away. Old men, forgotten men, yesterday's men. But the return of British troops to Irish streets breathed new fire into the Republican movement. Men whose records were gathering dust in RUC files emerged from the shadows in the full glare of world media attention. A new provisional Irish Republican Army, an old agenda.
We want the withdrawal of British troops from Ireland as soon as possible, so that all sections of the Irish community can sit down and settle their differences between themselves without outside foreign interference.
The campaign to achieve that objective assumed a ruthlessness unseen in Ireland for 50 years. The destruction of Brit property, the murder of members of the security forces, attacks on police and army bases, civilians killed for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The provisionals had declared war. The threat of a renewed IRA onslaught prompted a predictable unionist response: internment, imprisonment without trial, detention without proof. On the 9th of August, police and troops swooped. 200 people, almost exclusively Catholic, were rounded up and detained. Most were small fry. Their big fish had escaped the net. Intensive follow-up operations in Catholic areas provided the justification the Unionist government wanted. Republicans, nationalists, Catholics were arming for revolution.
Every means has been tried to make terrorists amenable to the law, nor have such methods been without success, because a substantial number of the most prominent leaders of the IRA are now serving prison sentences. But the terrorist campaign continues at an unacceptable level, and I have had to conclude that the ordinary law cannot deal comprehensively or quickly enough with such ruthless viciousness.
But this medicine served to inflame the wound. Applied as it was to just one community, internment only fueled Catholic resentment. Internment did not work. Meanwhile, divisions across the community were becoming absolute. Many Catholics and Protestants would not, could not live together. They must therefore live apart. Rehousing was hasty, as daylight brought relief from the nighttime violence. Houses were put to the torch. so that the other side would not be able to take them over, a form of ethnic cleansing. And as these houses were abandoned, families were forced to take refuge behind new barricades. Bewildered British troops could only stand by and watch as a British city on British soil systematically tore itself apart in riot and recrimination. Watchful soldiers guarded eyeless houses. Communities were kept apart by force of arms. Internment was to become a new civil rights issue, and on January the 30th, 1972, an anti-internment march left Derry's Catholic Cregan estate. Their way was barred by British paratroops. The ritual stone-throwing began. An army unit conditioned to match violence with violence was at first restrained in its response. Then the first shot rang out. Its source was uncertain.
Do not fire back with the moment!
13 unarmed civilians were shot dead on so-called Bloody Sunday. Their innocence is no longer disputed by the British authorities, but it was at the time.
We accuse the colonel of the parachute regiment of willful murder. We accuse the commander of land forces of being an accessory before the fact. We accuse the soldiers of shooting indiscriminately into a fleeing crowd, of gloating over casualties, of preventing medical and spiritual aid reaching some of the dying. It is untrue that shots were fired at the troops in Roosevelt Street before they attacked. It is untrue that any of the dead or wounded that we attended were armed.
The ghosts of 1916 had been raised on the streets of Derry half a century on. Many concluded that Britain had shown once again a carelessness, a callousness about its own closest colony. Bloody Sunday would haunt Britain and British policy in Ireland for decades to come.